Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Was Gott tut, das ist wohlgetan, which translates to what God does that is done well. Fairly straightforward chorale. We do have an interesting cadence here at the beginning of the second system, but we will get to it when we get to it. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. So 1 sharp in the key signature. We start on G major. We end on G major. I reckon we're in the key of G major. Passing tones in the inner voices before we get G, B, D, and G. Another G major triad, no need to reanalyze. And then we have F sharp, A, D, and A. It's a 5-6 chord. And then we get E, E, G, and B, which is a 6 chord. A variation on a very common progression we have in the introduction to most chorales, 1, 5, 6, 1. I'd say that's probably, if not the most common, in contention for one of the most common chord progressions at the beginning. So 6 switches this up from 1, 5, 6, 1 to 1, 5, 6, 6. It's a deceptive progression. We also have a passing 7th in the bass before we get C, E, G, and C. It's a 4 chord, C major, root position. This C is a chord tone, this D is a non-chord tone, but this E is a chord tone. We then have D, B, G, and D. It's G major over D, it's a 1-6-4 chord. This E is a non-chord tone, but this G is a chord tone. And then we get D, A, F sharp, and C. It's 5-7, D7, so 1-6-4 going to some type of a 5 chord. That's a pretty normative cadential formula. And then we have an anticipation here in the melody before our imperfect authentic cadence. And actually, something that I'd like to have up here is the fact that this melody, or this chorale, is accompanied by 2 horns. So some of the cadences that do look like certain types of cadences may be subverted by the fact that there is a horn playing above them, but it looks like this cadence is still an imperfect authentic cadence, so that is good for us. Looking ahead, we have, this is a tonic triad, of course. I just assumed that was implied, but yes, it's a tonic triad. We then have a perfect authentic cadence here in the key of G major again, no modulation, fairly straightforward phrase. C, G, C, and E, that's a 4 chord, C major, passing 7th in the alto, D, F sharp, A, and D, that's a 5 chord. Sorry, my pencil lead broke. 4 going to 5, fairly normative progression. Then we have E, G, E, and C. It's a deceptive cadence, or just part of an ascending line. This is C major over E, which is a 4-6 chord, and when we have 4-6 in this ascending configuration, it's quite common for it to go to 1, and when it is going to 1, we bridge it with a leading tone in between the 2 bass notes. I guess it's when we have a tonic in the bass. So 6 going to 1 in the bass in this ascending configuration is often linked by this leading tone. I might even go as far to say as it is always linked. And sometimes we have an entirely voiced chord when we look at the aggregate of the rest of the voices. F sharp, A, C, and E is F sharp minor 7 flat 5, which is 7-7. 4 going to 7 is probably the most common subdivided chord progression in all of the chorales. We then have G, B, D, and B, which is our tonic triad, root position, G major, passing tone in the tenor before we get C, G, E, and A. The A is very brief though. The C is what gets the majority of the emphasis here, which makes me feel like even though this could be analyzed as a 2-6-5 chord, you know what, I'm going to analyze this as a 2-6-5 chord because that's what I have in my notes, but I think 4 in root position is also a valid analysis, depending on how you look at it, but 2-6-5 versus 4, it's really 6 of one, half dozen of another, because you can't spell 2-6-5 without 4 in the first place, so they're very similar to one another. We then have D, G, D, and B. It's another 1-6-4 chord, G major over D. Then we have F sharp, D, D, F sharp, D, and A. That's another 5 chord, so 1-6-4 going to 5, very similar to our first phrase, and similar to our first phrase again, we have an anticipation before our final chord, G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position. Looking ahead, we have somewhat of an ambiguous phrase. I have it analyzed as a half cadence in the key of G major because that's what it sounds like to me. It ends on a 5 chord with a 5th of the chord in the melody as well, all arguments in favor for it being a half cadence, but there might be an argument that what we have here is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. I don't think that that's what's happening though. We then have G, B, G, and D to start the phrase off. That's another G major chord, no need to reanalyze. And then we have C, C, G, and E, that's a 4 chord. And this is part of an ascending chromatic bass line. And we know when we have chromatic bass lines that are half-step movement, we get interesting chord progressions. Not super interesting here, but it's interesting enough. After our passing seventh in the tenor, we have C sharp, A, and E. As a secondary dominant, this C sharp is the leading tone to D, which we know is the object of this tonicization. This would be 5/6 of 5. A major over C sharp would be the dominant of D, passing seventh in the alto, and then I think we cadence on 5. Of course, if we were in the key of D major, this would just be 5 going to 1, but with 4 going to 5 and this secondary dominant being an intermediary between the two chords, it really does feel like we're in the key of G major still. Now going ahead, we have an interesting phrase here. I do think that this is an imperfect authentic cadence, but it's a particular type of imperfect authentic cadence that we haven't heard in a while. Still one that is perfectly relevant to the chorales. This would be what I've been calling a subdominant cadence, where it feels like we're cadencing on the 4 of the chord, the same way that, or the 4 of the key, same way that we've cadenced on 5 here in a half cadence. Here we're cadencing on a 4 chord, but because subdominant cadence is not a conventional term, I've analyzed it as an imperfect authentic cadence where there is a brief switch to the key of the subdominant, and I'll show you what that looks like when we get to it. We start off with a D, D, F sharp, and A. That's another 5 chord with the passing seventh in the bass. We then have B, D, G, and D. Tonic triad, first inversion, G major over B. Then we have 3 neighbor tones here. That leaves us with A, C, A, and D. A little bit of a D7 vibe going on here, but no F sharp. I'm not going to analyze it because the chord is not entirely intact, but there is some semblance of a 5 chord going on here, I guess bridging the lack of a progression between these two repeated chords. 1/6 going to 1/6, B, D, G, and D, literally the exact same, but we do have this interesting F natural here, and this F natural indicates to me that we have moved to the key of C major, or we are tonicizing C major, and this is now 5. Because if this were just a passing seventh in the key of G major, this would be F sharp, but F natural indicates to me that that flatted seventh is changing the role of this chord from tonic to dominant. Something I have in my notes is tonic to 5 of 4. It's a somewhat common convention in the chorales, but we eventually cadence on C, 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 E, and G, and we do have the 5th of the chord in the melody, which is typically a hallmark of the half cadence in Bach, but in this case, it's not a half cadence. But I'm calling this 1. In the key of G major, if you did decide to keep it in the key of G major, this would be I would say 5 of 4, not 5 of 5. If I said that earlier as well, I meant 5 of 4. 5 of 4 going to 4. The same way that we had 5 of 5 going to 5 here. It makes me feel like 5 of 4 going to 4 just makes sense, and this is just a sequence of sorts. But the cadence, I feel like, is more so justified with this language here. I still haven't found any writing about subdominant cadences in Bach or anything of the like, so if you're watching this video and you have resources that you could point me in the direction of, that would be fantastic. I'd love to read up on them and have that be a more consistent thing that I can include in my analyses when they come up. But yes, this is clearly 5 of 4 going to 4, but because we don't really have the language for it, I think this is a 5-to-1 progression in terms of C as well. They're both accurate ways of describing it. Next phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, and in the same way that this is sort of like a faux modulation, like it's a pseudo modulation to C major, we never really leave the key of G major, but we go to the key of C major kind of in name more than anything else, or in convention more than anything else. I feel like we then have to consider this C major chord as our 4 chord in the key of G, and we briefly go to the key of G before we visit the key of D major for the entirety of this phrase. So after our, I guess, like clerical moving back to the key of G major, this 4 chord does take us back to G, G, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad. And then we immediately go to some type of D major chord, D, D, G, and A, but this G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. It's this F sharp, that's our chord tone, and it happens over an A as well, so Bach doesn't pull a sneaky on us or anything here. We have a fully voiced D major chord with the resolution intact as well. But in kind of an interesting fashion, we move to the key of D major over this D chord as well, at least I think so. Of course, we have a modulation zone here where either this G major could be our modulation point or this D major could be our modulation point. But remember, this modulation to C here is a quasi-modulation. It's not really happening in the grand scheme of the music. We are ultimately cadencing on 4, but like I said, because there are really only 4 groups of 4 type, or not 4 groups, sorry, there's 4 groups. Is 4 groups the right way to say it? I was going to say that there are 4 different types of cadence: the authentic, the deceptive, the plagal, and the half. And this doesn't really fit any of those categories when we stay in the key of G major, but when we look at it in terms of C major, which for all intents and purposes the F natural is doing that, we have an imperfect authentic cadence. So we look like we're going from C to G to D, like ascending the circle of fifths by notch each time. It looks like we're doing that in very quick succession, but remember to take this C major modulation with a grain of salt. We're moving to D major here, really from G major. We then have D, D, E, and G. I reckon actually what's happening here is this this is a B. D, B, E, and G. I don't think this is a 4-4-2 chord. I think, actually, I'm going to walk that back. I do think this is a 4-4-2 chord happening here. And the reason why I think this is a 4-4-2 chord, this did not make it into my notes, is because the chord that we have subdivided here, C sharp, A, E, and G, is like a passing 5-6 chord, and 2-4-2 wants to go to 5-6. A diatonic fourth below, or no, a diatonic fifth below, and in first inversion, because the chordal seventh, which this D is right here in relation to this E minor 7 chord, is resolving down by step like we expect. After our 5-6 chord, we have D, A, E, and F sharp. We know this E is sort of functioning like a 9/8 suspension over the bass, so we know that 1 is being implied here, but because the bass changes over the resolution, it sort of gets turned into 1-6. So whether you analyze this as 1 or 1-6, that's entirely up to you. I'm going to call it 1-6 because that's more in line with how I've been analyzing consistently. If there's a change in the chordal structure when we get a resolution over the bass, I'll analyze it that way. But then we get G, G, D, and G, which is an interesting 3 root 1/5 spelling, so there is a missing third in this chord, but we know that 4 is being implied, and this A, and F sharp is like a 1-6-4 chord that's happening off of the beat, and it's not really happening in a context that we would expect. Typically 6-4 chords are passing, or part of a pedal figure, or seen in a cadential situation like so, which is kind of like a pedal 6-4 as well. But here it's like a neighboring 6-4, so that's interesting, but it's happening over such a brief period of time that I don't really know how significant it really is. But 3 of the voices are moving. I feel compelled to analyze it. We then have G, B, D, and E. That's E minor 7 over G, 2-6-5. We know that Bach loves those. This E is a chord tone. No need to mark it. And then we have A, C sharp, and E. That's our 5 chord, what we would expect after 2-6-5, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on D major, tonic triad, root position, D, F sharp, A, and D. Looking ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, or sorry, not D major, in the key of G major, and this D major triad, which is what I was getting ahead of myself about, is our gateway, in my opinion, back to the key of G. It's now our 5 chord. Bach often does this near the end of a chorale where he cadences in the key of the dominant. Even in minor keys, he'll cadence on a major dominant sometimes mid-chorale, and he'll just usher forth into the, or back, or I guess cycle back to the original key. But we start the chorale off with a bit of a deceptive progression. We have B, F sharp, B, and D. That's B minor, which is a 3 chord with the passing 7th in the alto. And then we get E, E, G, and C. If you've watched my videos by now, you know that I mix up my clefs all the time. The fact that the bass clef is the only one in bass clef doesn't help, but I'm also not the strongest reader, so I really have to take the time to look, which is why I analyzed the chorale twice, once in my notes and once here, because the second time around I'm always more accurate. But this is C major in first inversion. That's a 4-6 chord. And again, we see 4-6 in this ascending configuration, so we're looking for some type of passing leading tone between the two notes, E and G. And here we actually get another 7-7 chord, F sharp, E, A, and C, which is F sharp minor 7 flat 5. Again, 4 going to 7, probably the most common subdivided chord progression in all of Bach, or just, I guess, predominant, dominant progressions are very common. 2 going to 5, 4 going to 7, but I feel like I see 4 going to 7 with much more frequency than 2 going to 5 as a subdivided progression. We then have G, D, B, and B. That is our tonic triad G major with 2 passing tones in the inner voices. And with the inner voices here, we actually get G, E, C, and B. And that would be a 4-4-3 chord, C major 7 over G. And I don't know, I'm going to mark it because this progression was created by moving 2 voices. Why shouldn't this one? All in all, I don't think it necessarily matters that you're this granular. What really matters is you're getting the majority of the harmonic rhythm and subdivided chord progressions that matter. But here, it doesn't hurt to be that more specific. So I'll include it in my analysis. We then have G, A, D, and A. This G is a lower suspension, kind of like a 9-10 suspension, or I guess a 2-3 suspension underneath the tenor, or the melody, a 9-10 suspension under the melody. But we have F sharp, A, D, and A, which is D major over F sharp. That's a 5-6 chord. And we go immediately to our tonic triad, G major, G, G, D, and B, which is where we would expect a 5 chord to resolve, more specifically a 5-6 chord as well. We then have E, E, and C happening here. So this E is a non-chord tone, this E is a non-chord tone, this C is a non-chord tone. E, G, E, and C is like a passing 4-6-4 chord. 3 voices are moving, so I feel like chances are there is a subdivided chord progression here if the chord is analyzable. And then we have C, G, E, and A, another 2-6-5 chord, A minor 7 over C. Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations, and we're looking for a 5 chord afterwards. This A is a chord tone, by the way, we don't need to mark it. D, F sharp, D, and A. There's our 5 chord, D major, and then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position to wrap up our chorale, and that is today's analysis. All in all, fairly straightforward. Subdominant cadences are always very interesting. In this case, it looks like there's like a super rapid series of modulations going on. But again, just to reiterate, to cover my tracks here, this C major modulation here is more of a formality than anything else. You can very much treat this entire chorale up until this point in the key of G major and just imagine like this modulation doesn't exist. It is more so a commentary about the fact that we don't really have language to describe this cadence in a term like deceptive cadence or half cadence, and I think there should be, and I've been trying to use the term subdominant to describe that, but regardless, here we are. The analysis looks a little wonky, but do know that some secondary analysis here really drives home the fact that we see something similar going on between the first phrase in the B section and the second phrase in the B section. But other than that, chromatic bass lines are usually pretty cool. Lots of 1-6-4 going to 5 chords. Other than that, fairly straightforward chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon so you can get notified of my daily upload, and hit the like button if you enjoyed the video. It means that my videos will be seen by more people. That means more discussion, that means more analysis. I love that. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.